The story that you are about to hear is a compilation of documented true facts, featuring characters, events, or places that has played a role in shaping history. Please sit back and listen as I recite this narrative for you. Charles Albright is a serial killer from Dallas, Texas, convicted of killing 3 prostitutes in 1991. He was, they said, a kind of a Renaissance man, fluent in French and Spanish, a masterful painter, able to woo women by playing Chopin preludes on the piano or reciting poetry by Keats. Charles was adopted by Fred and Dell Albright after they discovered him in an orphanage. Fortunately for Charles, Dell was a school teacher and he was able to jump 2 grades at school due to her diligence and help with his education. She was a strict parent yet was overprotective of Albright at the same time. According to the story Dell would tell Charles later, his birth mother was only 16 years old when she got pregnant with him, but that she was an exceptional law student and was married to another student. But when her father found out, he had the marriage annulled and had her give up her baby for adoption, and if she didn't do it, he would disown her. When he was 11 years old, Dell introduced him to the world of taxidermy, even enrolling him in a mail order course. As Charles set to work on the dead birds he found, Dell was right beside him. She showed him how to use all the tools. The knife used to cut the skull, the little spoon used to scoop out the brains, the scalpel required to cut away the eyes from their sockets, the forceps that pulled out the eyes. She even skinned the first bird for him, teaching him not to cut too deep. He used to go to a taxidermy shop and stare at the boxes and boxes full of gloriously fake eyes. Owl eyes, eagle eyes, and deer eyes. He loved their iridescent gleam. He wished he could collect them the way other boys collected marbles. Yet Dell wouldn't let him. Taxidermists' eyes were too expensive. His frugal mother would say there was a better, cheaper way. She would open her sewing kit, look for exactly what she needed, and get to work. Then she and her son would place the birds in the oak china cabinet in front of the house with buttons for eyes. By the time he was 13, Charles had already been arrested for aggravated assault and was known to be a petty thief. Yet his accelerated education enabled him to finish school at 15 and enrolled at North Texas University. It didn't take long to become one of the school's most popular students. But he wasn't known as just a goody two-shoes. He was also a great prankster. By the end of his freshman year, he was arrested for being a member of a student burglary ring that broke into 3 stores and stole several $100s worth of merchandise. Dell went to the store owners and tried to reimburse them for what was taken. She tried to persuade the judge to let her act as his lawyer or take his place in prison. Dell worked to keep the matter hushed up so that no one in her neighborhood knew that Charlie had become a convicted felon. He was sent to prison for a year. After his release, he attended Arkansas State Teachers College and majored in pre-med studies. He began to date a lovely young English major, Betty Hester, and made plans to marry her. He did truly brilliant work in science, although he hardly studied. He made an A in his human anatomy course. It was said around school that Charlie Albright was going to go far. He even talked about going to medical school and becoming a surgeon. Found with stolen items, he was expelled from the college before graduation but not prosecuted. It was at this time that Albright embarked on a career in forgery. He created documents showing he had attained both bachelor's and master's degrees, which were false, and he began forging signatures. He married his girlfriend from college and they welcomed a daughter. Charles's wife was a teacher, but he failed to hold a job for long. Charles continued to forge checks, and while he was working as a teacher at a high school, his forgery was discovered. According to his college records, Charles Albright had a master's degree in biology from East Texas State University and was working on another master's in counseling and guidance. He was also about to enter ETSU's PhD program in biology. The principal was contacted by an ETSU official who told him that Charles faked his credentials. When Charles was confronted, he grinned ruefully and admitted to the crime. He needed to bend the rules a little, he explained, in order to get a teaching job. Because the forgery was a victimless crime, and because Charles himself, according to one ETSU administrator, was such a nice repentant fellow, the university decided to keep the transcript scandal out of the newspapers. It was embarrassing, after all, that a school could get bamboozled. Albright pleaded guilty to a fraud charge and received a year's probation. Charles was free to latch on to one new project after another. He rarely had a job that lasted longer than 3 months. He worked as a designer, an illustrator, a carpenter, and even became a bullfighter. He collected wine bottles, old movie posters, and signatures from stars who performed at the Venetian Room at the Fairmont Hotel. Charles still had a Pied Piper-like ability to captivate people. After visiting a friend who worked at the beauty salon in a Sanger Harris department store, Albright promptly went off to beauty school, got his beautician's license, and then persuaded the salon to hire him, with no experience at all, as a stylist. He told his stylist friend that he was also an accomplished artist. His friend paid him $250 to paint a picture of his wife. Charles worked for weeks on the woman's painting without finishing. He insisted that he needed to keep working on one special feature, the most difficult part of the painting. Tired of waiting, the friend decided to go to Albright's house to look at the work in progress. There in the living room was the 6 by 3 foot portrait. It was richly colored and remarkably realistic. The woman's hair, her mouth, her nose, her ears, her neck, everything was finished except for her eyes. In the middle of the painting were 2 round white holes. Months later, Albright finally painted the eyes, then repainted them to get them just right. When Charles was finished, his friend couldn't believe how well the painting turned out. It was, he realized, a mesmerizing portrait, especially the eyes. His wife's eyes were so perfectly recreated that they seemed to follow a person across the room. Charles and his wife later divorced in 1974. Charles was caught while stealing merchandise from a hardware store worth hundreds of dollars and was sent to prison again, this time for 2 years. However, he was released after only serving 6 months. On his release, he made friends with his neighbors and he became a trusted babysitter for children in the neighborhood. In 1981, after his mother died, while Albright was visiting some friends, he sexually molested their 9-year-old daughter. At court, he pled guilty and was only placed on probation. Not that he was guilty, he kept saying over and over. He had never touched that little girl. The girl's family was just looking for a scapegoat and they had picked on him, Charlie Albright, one of the most dedicated members of a Catholic church in East Dallas. The girl's parents tried to keep the matter quiet, especially at the church, because they did not want to stigmatize their daughter. So on March 25, 1985, in a nearly empty Dallas courtroom, he stood before a judge and confessed to knowingly and intentionally engaging in a deviant sexual intercourse with a girl under the age of 14. He was 51. In late 1985, Charles was living in Arkansas where he met a pretty shy widow named Dixie Austin, who quickly moved in with Charles. By the time he met Dixie, however, Charles Albright had already created another life for himself. Although he masterfully hid his secret from everyone who knew him, he was a veteran of red light districts all over Dallas. To some prostitutes, he was a whoremonger, a regular trick. To others, like Susan Peterson, he was even a sugar daddy. She listed him as her co-signer and best friend on bond applications in case the bondsman had to hunt her down. There is also evidence that Albright was a friend of Mary Pratt's long before she became a prostitute. Albright had a brief fling with one of Pratt's female friends and brought that woman and Pratt over to his house for parties. Other prostitutes say that when Pratt started turning tricks at the store, Albright became one of her customers. Soon, Albright was making the rounds. With some of the girls, he had a platonic relationship. He would pick them up, talk to them, take them to get a hamburger, and drop them back off, never even attempting sex. With others, he had standing sexual appointments, always in the afternoons, when Dixie was at work as a sales clerk at a gift shop in Redbird Mall. Perhaps it was no coincidence that Albright's life began to spin out of control after the death of his parents, Dell and Fred. Without them around to look out for him, a repressed part of Albright may have finally unleashed itself. He and Dell, who died of cancer in 1981, were not close in her last years. With her gone, Fred seemed more relaxed. Albright and his father became close. Several nights a week, Albright would take him to dinner at a nearby cafeteria. After Fred's fatal heart attack in 1986, Albright inherited at least $96,000 along with all of his parents' homes and properties in South Dallas. For what friends said were sentimental reasons, he kept the property in his father's name. On October 1, Charles took a job delivering newspapers in the middle of the night for the Dallas Times-Herald. Albright told Dixie, who by now was his common-law wife, that he needed more spending money. He had never been good with his finances. In 4 years, he had gone through his inheritance and he had yet to get a full-time job. Because Dixie got a monthly annuity check and worked daily in the gift shop, she paid most of their bills. Dixie wasn't exactly pleased with Charlie's decision. She said she couldn't get a good night's sleep with him gone. But Albright said it would work out fine. He would wake up around 3 in the morning, deliver papers on an Oak Cliff route between 4 and 6, and then be back in bed by 6:15. He and Dixie agreed that most of the money he made would go for the trips he took with his softball team. The well-built Albright was one of the better players in the city's senior slow pitch softball league. At the end of one game, some players were sitting around at the ballpark when 2 women in a car drove by slowly. The man joked that the women must be prostitutes. Then the team's manager shouted, "Hey Charlie, you're single. Why don't you take after them whores?" Charles replied by saying he'd kill them if he could. He got so mad that he marched off to his car and left. A few days later, when the team met for practice, the manager tried to apologize to Charles. Charles stated that it was a touchy subject for him since his birth mother was a prostitute. The FBI and a private investigator verified this story later on and found out that his biological mother was a nurse who lived and died in Wichita Falls. Yet somewhere in Albright's mind, the connection between prostitution and motherhood had been made. It is possible that Charles Albright was wrestling with a very twisted version of the Madonna whore complex, unconsciously seeking revenge on the mother figures who disappointed him by associating with prostitutes, the worst possible women he could find. Perhaps he hated what they had become. Perhaps he hated what he had become in their presence. Whatever the reason, if Albright had truly decided the time had come to kill, he had put himself in a perfect position to do it. Charles' first murder took place in December 13, 1990. The body of prostitute Mary Lou Pratt was discovered in the Oak Cliff neighborhood of Dallas. Her body was found lying face up. Her eyes were shot, her face and chest were badly bruised. She had been killed by a gunshot to the back of the head from a .44 caliber firearm. When the medical examiner lifted her eyelids, he discovered that both of her eyes had been removed and taken away from the scene. There were no eyeballs, no tissue, nothing. Mary Pratt's eyes had been cut out and removed so carefully that her upper and lower eyelids were left undisturbed. This was not an operation taught in medical school. The killer had to know how to slip a knife around the eyes, making sure not to injure the adjoining skin, and then cut the 6 major muscles holding each eye in the socket, as well as the rope-tough optical nerve. With the eyelids shut, it was impossible to tell the eyes were missing. Surely, whoever did this had to have had a lot of practice on someone or something else. On February 10, 1991, the body of another prostitute was found, and she also was almost completely nude, with her t-shirt pulled up to display her breasts in the same manner as Pratt. Susan Peterson had been shot once through the top of her head, once in the back of her head, and once in her left breast. Her body was found just outside of the city limits of South Dallas, and the medical examiner found that this victim bore another grisly similarity. Her eyes had been surgically removed. The case fell on Detective Oliver. When a pathologist began the standard examination, he saw that her eyes were gone. He called the detective over and mentioned that the Dallas Police Department had had a similar case just 2 months earlier. Oliver did some checking, and within 24 hours, he traveled to the police department's homicide offices. Soon, there were meetings with the sergeants and lieutenants and with the chief in charge of a homicide. While police officials deliberately avoided the phrase serial killings to describe what was happening, everyone in the room knew what they were hunting for. A twisted, brilliant murderer, someone who dropped bodies on quiet residential streets where they were certain to be found the next morning. On December 13, 1990, patrol officers John Matthews and Regina Smith spoke with Veronica Rodriguez, a brazen charcoal-eyed prostitute, because Smith noticed a nasty gash across her forehead and what looked like a thin knife cut across the front of her neck. Rodriguez told the officers that the previous night, she had been picked up by a trick, driven a long way south to a field, and raped. The man, a white man, she said, then tried to kill her, but she escaped and ran towards the house. The man at the house just happened to be someone she knew. He also just happened to know the man who was trying to kill her. Matthews and Smith gave each other a look. Rodriguez was a notorious liar. No doubt she had been in some kind of fight, but in the middle of nowhere, she ran right into the house of someone she knew. This was probably another of Rodriguez's pity stories, which she often told the cops so they would feel sorry for her and leave her alone. 2 days later, Matthews and Smith saw Rodriguez again. She was sitting with a balding, middle-aged white man in the cab of an 18-wheeler. His name was Axton Schindler. Rodriguez asked them not to arrest him, claiming that this was the guy who saved her from the killer. But the man said he had no idea what she was talking about. He said he had known her for years and was just giving her a ride to the motel. He didn't protect her from any killer. He didn't even have sex with her. He was just a long-distance truck driver doing her a favor. Rodriguez, the officers added, was lying once again. They carted her to jail for prostitution and hauled Schindler in for his unpaid tickets. Axton Schindler's address was 1035 El Dorado. Although Matthews and Smith would not know it for months, a clue to the murderer's identity had fallen right in their laps. Shirley Williams was the third prostitute found dead in the area on March 18, 1991. She had been shot twice, once through the top of her head and once in the face. She had also suffered a beating with multiple bruises on her face and a broken nose. Like the 2 other victims, her eyes had been taken away. The autopsy on Shirley Williams' body would show that the surgery had been hurried. The broken tip of an X-Acto blade was found embedded in the skin near her right eye. But there were still no witnesses, no murder weapon, no fingerprints. Worse, the killer had now murdered a black woman and he had moved locations. Just as the detectives had feared, the publicity about the case had sent the killer away from the store and his South Dallas dumping ground. There was no telling where he would hit again. If the killer could get Peterson, Matthews and Smith said, then he could get any of the women. They surmised that the killer knew every corner of the Ward district, all of the alleys and all of the streets. He was able to pick up Peterson and vanish within seconds. He also must have been one of her regular customers. Otherwise, she never would have left her guard down. Certainly, she wouldn't have allowed him to shoot her 3 times. She would have pulled out a razor and fought back. Once word of Shirley Williams' killing spread, the Star Motel turned into a ghost town. Some prostitutes, black and white, told officers John Matthews and Regina Smith that they were leaving Dallas. Others said that they were getting out of the business. A few women, so desperate for drug money that they couldn't leave, moved together to a street corner next to the home of a man who promised to serve as their lookout and bodyguard. Cruising the area, Matthews and Smith spied a black prostitute, Brenda White, a 17-year-old veteran of the neighborhood. White tended to work alone on a street corner in front of a church, away from the other prostitutes. White told the officers that she had just had to maze a man the other night. White told the officers that a few days before, a trick in a dark station wagon had pulled up alongside her and that she had gotten inside the car. He was a husky-looking white man with salt and pepper hair, cowboy boots, and blue jeans. "Let's go to a motel," she told him. "No," he said. "I've got a spot we can use." As a way to protect herself, White never allowed a new trick to take her anywhere but a whore motel, so she told him to drop her off immediately. Suddenly, a change came over his face, she recalled. It was like anger, rage. He said, "I hate whores. I'm going to kill all of you mofo whores." Before he had a chance to grab her, White shot a stream of mace into his face, threw open the door, and jumped out, breaking the heel of one of her favorite red leather pumps. For the rest of the day, Matthews and Smith could not shake White's story from their minds. They flipped through their notebooks. They thought about everything the whores had told them since the killings began. Always, they returned to Veronica Rodriguez's rambling talk about being raped. They drove up to the Dallas County Constable's office near Jefferson Boulevard. There, a deputy constable on duty, Walter Cook, agreed to help them. They checked the address that Schindler gave them, 1035 El Dorado, but Fred Albright's name came up as the owner of the property. Cook punched in another code. It turned out that this Fred Albright also owned property on a street called Cotton Valley. Wasn't Cotton Valley in the very neighborhood in South Dallas where the first two prostitutes were found? Cook kept typing. Fred Albright, the computer reported, was dead. Matthews and Smith stared at the screen. The only clue in the case led them to a dead man. Then after a pause, Cook said softly, "Maybe this has something to do with a man named Charles Albright." Several weeks before, Cook explained that he had come to the office early one morning and had answered a call from a woman who would not identify herself. The woman had been friends with Mary Pratt, she said, and through Pratt had met a man whom she briefly dated. He was a very nice man, she said, but he had an odd love for ice. She also happened to mention that he kept X-Acto plates in his attic. Cook asked for the man's name. "Charles Albright," she said. If any other constable's deputy had been helping Matthews and Smith that day, the link to Albright might have never been made, but good fortune prevailed. Cook typed in another code and personal information for Charles Albright popped up on the screen. Born August 10, 1933. Address 1035 El Dorado. Their hearts racing, Matthews and Smith rushed to the county's identification division and asked to see Albright's criminal record. The officers discovered a string of thefts, burglaries, and forgeries and the charge of sexual intercourse with a child. The clerk then pulled out a mugshot of Albright, a photo of a rather handsome, well-built man with grayish hair, angular features, and deep-set dark eyes, just like the man Brenda White had described. On their way to the homicide department, Matthews and Smith rehearsed everything they wanted to say. They could not seem unprepared, Matthews insisted. It was nerve enough for two Raw Patrol officers to visit the legendary Westfalen and tell him they believed they had found the killer, although they had no solid evidence to prove it. Westfalen greeted them politely. Matthews started, then Smith interrupted, and soon they were both talking at once. Westfalen sighed. "Calm down," he said. "Let's take it slow." A few minutes later, after they had finished their presentation, Westfalen decided they were onto something. He put together a photo lineup of 6 mugshots and told Matthews and Smith to show it to Brenda White. Immediately, Smith and Matthews tracked White down in her usual street corner and asked her if she recognized any of the men in the mugshots. White unhesitatingly pointed to Albright's picture and said he was the man who attacked her. A little while later, they showed the same lineup to Veronica Rodriguez. According to Matthews, when Rodriguez got to the third picture, Albright's, she started trembling. Suddenly fearful, she refused to identify anyone. Matthews called Westfalen with the bad news. Rodriguez is so afraid of the killer, he said, that she won't pick out his picture. "Bring her down here to see me," Westfalen growled. Westfalen knew if he could not get Rodriguez to break, he wouldn't have the evidence to go after Charles Albright. Brenda White's story offered only the prospect of a misdemeanor assault charge. But if Rodriguez identified Albright, the Dallas police could file charges for attempted murder, get a search warrant, and look through his house for evidence that might connect him to the 3 murders. Smith and Matthews dragged Rodriguez downtown. In a small interrogation room, Westphalen stared with his icy blue eyes at the crack-addicted Rodriguez. Rodriguez began to shake again. Tears poured out of her eyes. She wouldn't look at the pictures laid out before her. Trying to control his anger, Westphalen took a different tack. He told Rodriguez about the 3 girls, how they were brutally killed, how the police couldn't get the killer off the street without her help. "This is so easy," he said. "Pick out the picture of the guy who assaulted you, and we will get him and put him in jail where he can't hurt you." Slowly, Rodriguez looked over the mugshots. While Westphalen and another officer watched, she reached for Albright's photo, turned it over, and signed her name. On March 22, 1991, Charlie Albright was arrested in his home. The trial began on December 13, 1991. The prosecution suffered many blows and their case seemed circumstantial at best. The only evidence that was solid was the forensic evidence. Hair found at Williams' murder scene matched Albright. For the first time in its history, the DA's office was going for a murder conviction based solely on controversial hair evidence. Days after Albright's arrest, the city's forensic lab reported that hairs found on the bodies of the dead prostitutes were similar to hair samples taken from Albright's head and pubic area. As evidence goes, hairs are not as conclusive as fingerprints. It's impossible to tell how many other gray-haired man's hairs might look similar to Albright's hairs under a microscope. Yet in this case, the lab kept running tests. Lab technicians said the hairs found on the blankets in the back of Albright's pickup truck were similar to hair samples from the first 2 prostitutes killed, Mary Pratt and Susan Peterson. Hairs found in Albright's vacuum cleaner matched the hair from the 3rd prostitute killed, Shirley Williams. An additional piece of the puzzle came from John Matthews and Regina Smith. The officers found a prostitute, Tina Connolly, who claimed that Albright was one of her regular afternoon customers on Fort Worth Boulevard. She never saw him cruise after dark, she said, except for one time, the night Shirley Williams disappeared. Connolly took Matthews and Smith to a secluded field near Fort Worth Boulevard where Albright used to take her for sex. There they spotted a yellow raincoat, just like the one Williams was last seen wearing, and a blanket. Hairs on the coat and blanket matched Albright's hair. Albright never testified. Throughout the trial, he sat quietly in his chair, his shoulders slumped like a weak, humbled figure. Shook in his closing argument, derisively called Albright this former biology teacher, bullfighter, college ace, smart man who just can't seem to have a job. But Shook warned the jury not to underestimate Albright, that he had grown much smarter during this trial, that if he ever got out of jail, he wouldn't make the same mistakes again. On December 18, 1991, the jury deliberated and found Charles Albright guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison for the murders of Shirley Williams, Mary Lou Pratt, and Susan Peterson. Hey everyone! I just wanted to express how grateful I am that you took the time to listen to my narration. Hopefully you enjoyed it. I am Twysted Mind and please enjoy the rest of your day. Salamat!